Hi everyone. So this week you will have already had started with the PowerPoint on the immune system and the lymphatic system, and then I'm just going to start in on the first maybe half, maybe slightly less than half of this heart lecture, and then we'll pick up the rest of it next week. The heart is approximately the size of a closed fist, and it's located in a region in the chest or thorax known as the mediastinum, which is between the second rib and the fifth intercostal space, basically like between the fifth and the sixth rib. Excuse me. It's also located just left of that mid-sternal line. So you see more of it to the left of the sternum than the right. And it's enclosed in this double-walled fibrous sac known as the pericardium. The pericardium has two layers. There's the superficial fibrous pericardium, which has the consistency of almost like onion skin. It's very tough, and this prevents and protects, anchors, and prevents the heart from overfilling. It's a nice like protective boundary to keep it within the confines. The pericardium has an inner serous, right, much thinner, sort of lubricated, two-layered serous pericardium. So there's two layers to this. The parietal layer, think parietal always lines like a cavity or a wall of something. So you have that outer fibrous, very thick onion skin-like pericardium, and then lining the inside of that is the slippery, thin parietal layer of the serous pericardium. The visceral layer, also known as the epicardium, is the serous layer that's right on the external surface of the heart itself. And the visceral and parietal serous pericardium are separated, by a fluid-filled pericardial cavity. Think of it as it decreases friction, right? As the heart contracts and expands, it prevents those layers from rubbing upon one another and giving us pain. When this happens, or rather when there is a swelling and an irritation of the pericardium, it can cause extreme chest pain as well as sometimes other symptoms. And the causes of pericarditis, which I should have prefaced it, it's called pericarditis. The causes of this are varied. So it includes viral and bacterial infections as well as post-infarct pericarditis, which is post-heart attack. If we look at the layers of the heart wall, we have the outermost layer known as the epicardium. This is a visceral layer of the serous pericardium, right? One and the same. That visceral layer is also known as the epicardium, and it's the most superficial or external layer of the heart. The myocardium makes up the bulk of the heart. It's the muscular layer, and it's comprised of bundles of cardiac muscle cells, and it also contains the fibrous skeleton of the heart. So it's that interlacing, irregular connective tissue that gives the heart the ability to stay together despite having to beat constantly throughout our life. And then most internal is the endocardium, which is the layer of the heart that comes in contact with the blood and actually continues on to become the endothelial lining of the blood vessels. And it's important to note, while this is a cartoon, that the way that the cardiac muscle bundles are arranged is much different than we see in skeletal muscles, right? It's kind of like if you wring out a towel. You do it in that circumferential motion where you're twisting in the opposite directions. And when you think about the heart, it has to do the same thing, right? The heart doesn't contract up and down to become shorter and longer. Instead, it wants to squeeze as much blood as it can, as much as it's supposed to, out to get it out to either the lungs or to the rest of the body. The heart is comprised of 4 chambers. The 2 superior chambers are known as the atria, and they're separated internally by something called the interatrial septum. And then we see external manifestations or expansion of the heart, of the atria, known as the auricles. They look like little ears. And these are sort of the overflow. If needed, they can increase the blood volume of the atria. And then the 2 inferior chambers, and much larger and more muscular, are known as the ventricles. So the atria are sort of the collecting chambers, where the ventricles are the pumps. The ventricles are separated by the interventricular septum, and then the anterior and posterior on the external side of the heart there's an interventricular sulcus, and this kind of marks the delineation between the left and the right ventricles on the outside of the heart. In terms of the atria, as I mentioned, they're the receiving or collecting chambers. Their walls are ridged by something called pectinate muscles. The vessels that enter the right atrium are the superior vena cava, and dumping venous blood from the upper part of the body, the inferior vena cava from the lower parts, and then the coronary sinus, taking the blood from the heart itself, the deoxygenated blood. The vessels that enter the left atrium are the right and left pulmonary veins. And I want to I wanted to just point out that for the most part, veins are carrying deoxygenated blood and are moving towards the heart, and then arteries are carrying oxygenated blood away. So with the pulmonary veins, they're adhering to the rule of returning to the heart, but they're the only ones that are carrying oxygenated blood. The ventricles are the discharging or pumping chambers. Their walls are ridged by trabeculae carnae, and there are papillary muscles that project into the ventricular cavities. The vessel that's leaving the right ventricle is the pulmonary trunk, and I know I botched this on the question for the homework. The vessel that's leaving the left ventricle is the aorta. I think I just stated aorta twice. The heart is basically two side-by-side pumps. The right side is the pump for what's known as the pulmonary circuit, meaning that the vessels that carry blood to and from the lungs. The veins, like I said, go towards the heart, with the exception of the pulmonary veins. They do also return to the heart, but they're carrying oxygenated blood. The left side is the pump for what's known as the systemic circuit, and these are the vessels that carry the blood to and from all the rest of the body tissues. And again, artery away from the heart. So if we look at the pathway of blood through the heart, if we start at the right atrium, right, we have the deoxygenated blood returning from the superior vena cava, the coronary sinus, and the inferior vena cava. It passes through the tricuspid valve and goes into the right ventricle. Now the blood in the right ventricle, keep in mind, is lower in oxygen. So where do we want to send it to get reoxygenated? We want to send it to the lungs. So from the right ventricle, we have the blood go through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the structure known as the pulmonary trunk, right here, which then splits into the left and right pulmonary arteries. Some folks, I worked in pulmonary studying this specifically, so the debate is alive and well, whether we call it the main pulmonary artery and then the left and right pulmonary arteries, or we call it the pulmonary trunk. I think it's easier to call it the trunk, but whatever. And then these pulmonary arteries travel into smaller and smaller vessels into the pulmonary capillaries and pick up oxygen in the lungs. Excuse me. Now, from the lungs, after the blood has picked up oxygen, it returns to the heart through the pulmonary veins. These are the one exception, right? They're veins, they're returning to the heart, which is in line, but they're carrying oxygenated blood. This oxygenated blood enters the left atrium. From the left atrium, that oxygenated blood passes through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle through the aortic semilunar valve, into the aorta, and then from the aorta into the systemic circulation to the rest of the body. The coronary circulation, oftentimes we forget about this. The heart is constantly working. It never gets a break or we'd be dead. So it needs constant blood supply and blood renewal. So the functional blood supply to the heart itself is known as the coronary circulation. Arterial supply contains many anastomoses or junctions. This is sort of a fail-safe, right? You'll hear about people that have like a certain percentage blockage in their heart, and while they may have had a myocardial infarction, in most cases it's discovered before they do. They might be having like chest pain. The reason for all these collateral routes is that the heart has to keep going, right? So at all costs, we hope that even say this right coronary artery is blocked, it can go through one of these, like the right marginal artery, to get across, to get blood flow to these regions. The arteries of the coronary circulation are the right and left coronary arteries. which run in that atrioventricular groove on the external surface of the heart, as well as the anterior interventricular arteries. The veins are the small cardiac vein, the anterior cardiac vein, and the great cardiac vein, which is on the posterior side of the heart. You can see it sort of transparent here. This is just a nicer, more sort of blown up view. This is the posterior surface, by the way. You can see the coronary sinus very well on the back between the atria and the ventricles. And there's also a link in the static PowerPoint to watch a really good video on this. In terms of homeostatic imbalances of the heart, angina pectoris is thoracic pain caused by a fleeting deficiency of blood delivery and therefore oxygen delivery to the myocardium. People kind of call it agita sometimes. And then a myocardial infarction, my apologies, I can't go back at this point, is when a part of the heart becomes blocked to its blood supply altogether, and because the heart is devoid of oxygen, that part of the heart, those myocardial cells die. And remember, muscle tissue and nerve tissue doesn't really regenerate, so it causes permanent damage to that region of the heart. Heart valves help to ensure unidirectional blood flow through the heart so that we're not having backflow and having deoxygenated blood mix with oxygenated, or backflow so that the heart kind of blows up and we don't get efficient blood supply to the body. The atrioventricular valves prevent backflow from the ventricles back into the atria, so they're between the atria and the ventricles. On the right side of the heart, we have the tricuspid valve that has 3 flaps. On the left-hand side, we have the mitral or bicuspid that has 2 flaps. On the bottom part, the posterior surface of those AV valves, we have something called chordae tendineae, aka heartstrings, that anchor the cusps of those AV valves to the papillary muscles which are embedded in the ventricular wall. The semilunar valves are between the ventricles and either the pulmonary trunk on the right or the aorta on the left. So we have the aortic semilunar valve and the pulmonary semilunar valve. If this is a top-down view of the heart, so we can see the vessels have been cut. So we see the tricuspid valve here on the right, the bicuspid or mitral on the left, and then we see those semilunar valves. You can see the valve, the cusps kind of look like half moons. This is a great picture showing, right? This is the inferior surface of one of the AV valves. Here are those chordae tendineae or heartstrings, and they're attached to the papillary muscles which are embedded in the ventricle wall. So when the ventricle contracts, it pulls down on these chordae tendineae, which pull on those flaps and close them so that there's not backflow into the atria above. This is a sagittal section. Actually, I take that back. This is a frontal section of the heart. So you see the interventricular septum. And important to note is the left ventricle has to pump blood under high pressure to all of the body, down to the tip of your big toe, whereas the pulmonary circuit is only sending blood to the lungs, which are right next door to the heart. And we want the blood to go under low pressure and go a little slower through the lungs. 1, so it doesn't rip apart the pulmonary capillaries, but 2, so it allows for adequate time for the blood to pick up oxygen. So because of that, you'll look at the free wall, right, the outer wall of the right ventricle as composed to the left. The left ventricular free wall, the left ventricular outer wall, will always be much, much thicker and more muscular than that on the right in a healthy heart. Okay, so we look through the pulmonary the cardiac circuit here. So blood returning to the heart, excuse me one second.